Police officers brutally beat a black man right outside his home, humiliating him in front of his wife and children. They couldn't imagine who this man really was, and the consequences of their actions were devastating. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories and share your thoughts in the comments. Jason Carter's fingers tightened around the leather steering wheel as his car smoothly glided down the quiet, tree-lined streets of his upscale neighborhood. The day had been long but victorious. Yet another case won, a corruption scandal involving a high-ranking police officer finally brought to justice. For Jason, moments like these were bittersweet. Victory in the courtroom was rewarding, but each win reminded him just how far the system had to go, and how, despite his prestigious career, his successes were often overshadowed by the color of his skin. The sleek, black sedan purred to a halt in front of his two-story home, a contemporary masterpiece nestled among other multi-million-dollar properties. The dim glow of the porch lights illuminated the path leading to the front door, where Jason's wife, Kira, would likely be reading a book, and their two children, Jordan and Maya, would be fast asleep upstairs. As Jason reached to turn off the ignition, the sudden flash of bright headlights blinded him, followed by the harsh glare of blue and red police lights. His heart rate spiked, a familiar and unwelcome sensation that coursed through him every time he saw flashing lights behind him, regardless of his innocence. The sharp, metallic clang of a police car door slamming shut echoed through the peaceful street. Jason blinked into the rearview mirror, his pulse quickening as two uniformed officers approached, hands on their holsters, their faces shadowed under the streetlights. He was home. This was his neighborhood, his driveway, his car. Yet here they were, ready to assume the worst. "Step out of the vehicle," one of the officers barked before he even reached the car. Jason's instincts told him to stay calm, to not make any sudden movements. He unfastened his seatbelt slowly, his attorney mind already racing with the legal implications of what was happening. "License and registration," the second officer snapped as Jason cautiously opened the door and stepped out, hands raised slightly to show he wasn't a threat. "This is my home," Jason began, his voice measured but firm. "I'm just pulling into my driveway." The first officer, a stocky man with a face set in a permanent scowl, cut him off. "We got a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description in the area. Step away from the car." Jason felt his stomach knot. His car? Stolen? It was absurd. He had the registration and paperwork inside, and yet he knew the routine, the game being played here. His skin, the luxury car, none of it fit the image they had in their heads of who belonged here. "I have my ID and registration in the glove compartment," Jason explained, keeping his voice calm, though inside he felt his frustration simmering. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the second officer growled, stepping closer, hand still on his holstered gun. His gaze flickered to the house as Kira appeared at the front door, the warm glow of the porch light casting a soft halo around her worried face. "Jason, what's going on?" she called out, her voice tinged with anxiety. "Go inside, Kira," Jason replied, trying to sound reassuring, though the tension in his chest made it hard to breathe. The first officer took a step forward, pushing Jason against the car with such force that the sharp edge of the doorframe dug into his side. Pain shot through him as the officer pressed harder, his breath hot and angry in Jason's ear. "You think you're above the law, huh? Think you can just drive whatever car you want, wherever you want?" the officer snarled, his knee pressing into Jason's leg, making it impossible for him to move. "This is my car," Jason gritted out. "My home. I live here. My kids are inside." "I said, keep quiet," the officer growled, reaching for his handcuffs. Without waiting for an explanation, the second officer grabbed Jason's arm, twisting it behind his back. From the porch, Kira's frantic voice cut through the chaos. "This is his car. This is our home. What are you doing?" Ignoring her, the officers forced Jason to the ground. The pavement was cold and hard against his cheek as they wrenched his arms behind him, metal cuffs biting into his wrists. Jason felt his breath catch in his throat. This was happening. He, a highly successful lawyer who had just spent the day fighting against police corruption, was being treated like a criminal in front of his own home, in front of his family. His children were watching through the window, their tiny faces pressed against the glass. Jason's heart sank. What would they think? How could they understand this? He wasn't just their father anymore. To the police, he was another black man in a nice car, a target. "Stop it! You're making a mistake!" Kira shouted, rushing toward them. But the officers didn't care. They hauled Jason up from the ground, his arms locked behind him, pain shooting through his shoulders. One of the officers gave Kira a sharp glance. "Get back inside, ma'am, or you'll be next." Kira froze, fear and anger mixing on her face as she stepped back, her eyes locking with Jason's in a silent, desperate plea. The officers shoved Jason toward the police car. His legs felt like they could buckle at any moment, but he forced himself to stand tall. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him broken. "This is a mistake," Jason said again, his voice hoarse but steady. "Check my ID, my registration. They're in the glove compartment. I'm an attorney, and this is my home." But his words fell on deaf ears. One of the officers opened the back door of the squad car and shoved him inside, the door slamming shut behind him. The cold, sterile interior of the car felt like a cage. Through the tinted window, Jason saw Kira standing by the curb, her hand over her mouth, her body trembling with shock and disbelief. The porch light flickered softly behind her, but all the warmth had drained from the evening. It was now filled with the cold weight of injustice. As the police car pulled away, Jason's thoughts spiraled. He had spent years building a life of respect, of success. He had fought tirelessly for justice, to change the very system that now treated him like nothing more than a criminal. His mind raced through all the cases he had won, the reforms he had fought for. None of it seemed to matter now, not when his skin color overshadowed everything else. The drive to the police station was long and silent. Jason sat in the back, the metal cuffs biting into his wrists, his body aching from the rough treatment. But the worst pain was the one that cut through his soul. The pain of knowing his family had witnessed everything, that his children would remember this night for the rest of their lives. And deep down, a flicker of anger began to burn, not just for himself, but for all those who had faced this before. This wasn't just his fight anymore. This was the fight of everyone who had ever been judged not by their actions, but by the color of their skin. The police car finally pulled up to the station, and as the doors opened, Jason knew this was far from over. This was only the beginning. The harsh slam of the police car door echoed through the dark, desolate parking lot of the station. Jason felt the cuffs tighten around his wrists as the officer yanked him roughly out of the back seat, ignoring the wince of pain that shot through his arms. The cold night air hit his face, but it did little to cool the fire simmering within him. Each breath he took was heavy, tinged with the bitterness of the injustice he had just endured. The station loomed ahead, its harsh fluorescent lights casting a stark glow on the concrete steps. Jason's feet dragged as the officers led him inside, their grip on his arms unyielding. He could feel the stares of passing officers, each one laced with curiosity or disdain. To them, he was just another suspect, another black man in handcuffs. The fact that he was an attorney, a man who had spent his career fighting for justice, was meaningless here. As they pushed him through the doors, Jason's mind reeled back to his family. Kira's tear-filled eyes, the terrified faces of his children. The image of their small hands pressed against the window as they watched their father being manhandled by the police sent a sharp pang through his chest. What were they thinking? How could he ever explain this to them? But now, here in the police station, Jason had no choice but to focus on the present. The officers shoved him into a small, dimly lit processing room where the sterile smell of disinfectant mixed with the low hum of fluorescent lights. The door clicked shut behind them, and Jason was left standing before a gray counter, facing yet another indifferent officer seated at a computer. The officer didn't bother to look up, simply tapping away on the keyboard as if this were just another mundane task in his night. "Name?" the officer droned, still not lifting his gaze. Jason clenched his jaw, suppressing the urge to lash out. "Jason Carter." The officer's fingers froze over the keyboard for a moment, a flicker of recognition in his eyes before his expression quickly returned to one of practiced indifference. Jason knew that name held weight, especially in legal circles. He had been a vocal advocate for police reform, having worked on cases that challenged excessive force and racial profiling. But tonight, in this station, his name was just another word in a system designed to suppress voices like his. "Charges?" the officer asked, finally looking up at the arresting officers. "Suspicion of grand theft auto," one of the arresting officers said with a smirk. "Vehicle matched the description." Jason's blood boiled. This was his car, his house. The whole situation was beyond absurd, but as always, there was no room for rationality when bias had already made its judgment. "Right," the officer at the desk muttered, typing in the information without question. Jason's heart sank as he saw the ease with which his dignity and rights were reduced to nothing more than bureaucratic entries on a screen. After what felt like an eternity, they led him deeper into the station, past rows of holding cells. The cold, sterile air grew heavier with each step. Inside the cells, men of all ages and races sat or stood in various states of discomfort, some glaring in anger, others lost in despair. Jason felt their eyes on him, a mixture of pity and disinterest, as though he were just another number added to the endless cycle of arrests and detentions. The officers brought him to an empty cell at the end of the row. Without a word, they unlocked the door and pushed him inside, the iron bars clanging shut behind him with a hollow finality. The sound resonated through the quiet space, filling Jason's ears like a death knell. He stood for a moment, breathing heavily as he tried to regain his composure. His wrists were raw from the cuffs, his shoulders ached from being twisted behind his back, but it was the emotional weight that felt unbearable. He sat on the cold, hard bench that lined the back wall of the cell and rested his head in his hands. For the first time that night, Jason allowed himself to feel the full extent of what had just happened. This wasn't the first time he'd been stopped by the police. He had grown up knowing that his skin color marked him for extra scrutiny. But it was the first time he had been treated with such blatant disrespect, such open aggression in front of his family. And for what? For daring to drive a nice car in his own neighborhood? His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but there was no sense to be found in a system that had long ago abandoned fairness for control. It wasn't just about him. It was about every black man who had ever been handcuffed without cause, every child who had ever watched their father be dragged away in front of their own home. The law that Jason had fought so hard to uphold now seemed like a weapon aimed directly at him. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The silence of the cell was interrupted only by the occasional shuffle of footsteps or the distant clank of keys. Jason's thoughts drifted back to Kira and the kids, wondering if they were okay, if they were safe. He hated that they had to see this, to witness firsthand the cruelty of a system they were supposed to trust. How could he ever explain this to his children? How could he reassure them that everything would be all right, when even he wasn't sure anymore? Time dragged on, and fatigue began to settle in. Jason leaned back against the cold wall, staring up at the flickering light above him. His mind replayed the events of the night over and over. The flashing lights, the aggressive shouts of the officers, the way they had thrown him to the ground as if he were a threat. And the faces of his children, those innocent, confused expressions that had burned into his memory. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Jason's heart rate quickened as he heard the keys jangling. The cell door swung open, and the officer from earlier, one of the men who had arrested him, stood there, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "Carter," he grunted. "You're free to go." Jason's brow furrowed. "What?" "Your paperwork checked out," the officer said with a dismissive shrug, as if it had all been a minor misunderstanding. But it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a violation. A blatant act of racism and aggression disguised as routine police work. Jason's blood surged with anger, but he forced himself to remain calm. There would be a time for that later. Now he needed to get home to his family. Without another word, Jason stood and stepped out of the cell. His body ached from the hours of sitting in the cramped space, but he kept his head high as they led him back through the station. He wouldn't let them see him broken, no matter how much they had tried. As they approached the front desk, the officer who had processed his arrest stood there, his expression slightly more cautious than before. "We're, sorry for the mix-up," the officer muttered, avoiding Jason's eyes. Jason said nothing. There was nothing to say to men like him. The damage had already been done. He collected his belongings, his phone, his wallet, the keys to his own car, and walked out of the station, the weight of the night still pressing down on him like a heavy shroud. Outside, the air was crisp and cold, the early morning hours casting a stillness over the city. Jason glanced at his phone and saw the messages from Kira, her worry bleeding through the screen. He texted her back, telling her he was coming home. But as Jason climbed into his car and drove away from the station, he knew this wasn't over. His mind replayed the moment the officers had thrown him to the ground, their callous disregard for his rights, their blind assumption of guilt based solely on the color of his skin. This wasn't just about him. It was about every black person who had ever been wrongfully targeted, every innocent man and woman who had been forced to endure the same humiliation, the same pain. Jason had spent his career fighting for justice, but now he realized that the fight was far from over. He couldn't just let this go. He couldn't let them get away with what they had done. As he drove back toward his home, back toward his family, Jason made a vow to himself. He would not rest until every one of those officers, every person who thought they could treat him, or anyone else like that, was held accountable. Justice wasn't just something he fought for in court. It was something he demanded in every corner of his life. And now, more than ever, he was determined to make sure it was served. The sun was beginning to rise as Jason pulled into his driveway, the soft morning light casting a pale glow over the quiet streets of his neighborhood. It should have been a peaceful sight, the kind of scene that brings comfort after a long night. But for Jason, the stillness only heightened the weight of what had happened. The police station, the handcuffs, the cold metal of the jail cell, it was all still fresh in his mind, the sting of injustice burning into his thoughts like a brand. Kira was waiting for him on the front porch, her arms crossed, worry etched into every line of her face. She rushed down the steps as soon as Jason parked, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of injury. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but tense, as if afraid of what he might say. "I'm fine," Jason replied, though the words felt hollow. Physically, he was unharmed, but the emotional toll was far greater. He could still feel the weight of the officers' hands on him, the way they had thrown him to the ground like he was nothing. Kira touched his arm gently, searching his eyes. "The kids, they didn't sleep. They were up all night, asking if you were going to be okay." Jason closed his eyes, the guilt hitting him hard. His children had seen him at his lowest, helpless and powerless against a system designed to tear him down. He had always wanted to protect them from the harsh realities of the world, but now that world had burst into their lives, uninvited and cruel. "I'll talk to them," Jason said quietly. He kissed Kira's forehead, offering her a small, forced smile before stepping into the house. The moment he crossed the threshold, Jason felt the weight of the night settle back onto his shoulders. The house was quiet, too quiet, and Jason could sense the tension in the air. Jordan and Maya, their young, innocent eyes wide with confusion and fear, peeked out from behind the staircase. "Daddy?" Jordan's voice was small, uncertain, and it broke Jason's heart to hear the fear laced in his son's words. Jason knelt down, opening his arms. Both kids rushed to him, wrapping their small arms around his neck, their bodies trembling slightly. "It's okay. I'm here," Jason whispered, holding them close. But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't enough. How could he tell his children that everything would be okay when he himself wasn't sure anymore? After a few moments, Jason pulled back, looking into their tear-filled eyes. "What happened last night? It was wrong," he began slowly, carefully choosing his words. "Sometimes people, they judge others based on things that don't matter, like the color of their skin. And that's what happened to me." "Why did they take you?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't do anything wrong." Jason swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in his throat. "They made a mistake, but I'm going to make sure they understand that." The kids looked at him, confused but trusting. Jason knew they didn't fully understand what had happened, and in a way he was grateful. They were still too young to bear the full weight of the world's ugliness. After settling the kids in the living room with Kira, Jason made his way to his home office. The moment he closed the door behind him, the weight of the night settled onto his shoulders fully, pressing down on him like an anchor. His mind raced, replaying every moment. The flashing lights, the shouting, the handcuffs, the way the officers had dismissed his rights as if they didn't matter. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person of color who had been wrongfully targeted, every life that had been shattered by the same systemic racism that had led to his arrest. Jason had spent years fighting for justice in the courtroom, but now the fight had come to his own front door, and he couldn't just walk away from it. He grabbed his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. His hands were steady, but inside a storm was brewing. He dialed the number of his colleague, a fellow attorney who had worked with him on several police misconduct cases. "Jason, came the groggy voice on the other end of the line. "It's early. What's up?" Jason took a deep breath. "We need to talk. Something happened last night. I was arrested." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "What?" "Jason, what the hell are you talking about?" Jason quickly relayed the events of the previous night. The wrongful arrest, the physical assault, the hours spent in a cold cell without any explanation. His colleague listened in stunned silence, the gravity of the situation sinking in with every word. "This is big," his colleague finally said. "If we play this right, this could blow the lid off the whole department. We've been waiting for something like this, a high-profile case that exposes their corruption." Jason knew his colleague was right. This wasn't just about his personal experience. This was a chance to shine a light on the systemic problems within the police force. But even as he recognized the opportunity, a deep sense of dread settled in his stomach. Going after the police, especially as a black man, was dangerous. It would put him and his family in the crosshairs of a system that was known to retaliate against those who challenged it. "I don't want this to be about me," Jason said, his voice firm. "This is bigger than that. We need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." "We will," his colleague assured him. "We'll take this to court, and I'll make sure the media knows about it. Once this goes public, the department won't have a choice but to respond." Jason nodded. Though the anxiety still gnawed at him, he knew this was the right thing to do, but it didn't make it any easier. The risks were high and the cost could be even higher. But there was no turning back now. Later that day, Jason sat in his lawyer's office reviewing the legal papers they were preparing to file. His colleague had already reached out to a journalist at a local news station, and the story was beginning to gain traction. The police department, facing public outrage, issued a vague statement about conducting an internal investigation. But Jason knew better than to trust that. They would try to sweep this under the rug, but he wasn't going to let them. The legal battle ahead would be long and grueling, but Jason was ready. He had spent his life fighting for others, and now he was fighting for himself, and for every person who had been wronged by the system. The media coverage was intensifying by the hour. News outlets across the state were picking up the story, framing it as yet another example of racial injustice within the police force. Jason's name was becoming synonymous with the fight for police reform, and while that brought a sense of pride, it also brought an increasing level of scrutiny. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of depositions, interviews, and media appearances. Every day, Jason felt the weight of public expectation grow heavier. But the hardest part was returning to the courtroom, not as an advocate for others, but as a victim of the same system he had spent his career challenging. The trial itself was nothing short of a spectacle. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and members of the public, all eager to see how the case would unfold. The officers involved in Jason's arrest were present, their faces impassive, their lawyers spinning a narrative that painted Jason as the aggressor. A black man driving a luxury car, acting suspiciously in a neighborhood where he didn't belong. But the truth couldn't be hidden behind legal jargon and twisted stories. As the evidence was presented, video footage of the arrest, witness testimonies from neighbors and bystanders, the narrative the officers had tried to create began to crumble. The facts were undeniable. Jason had been wrongfully arrested, targeted solely because of the color of his skin. As the trial progressed, the tension in the courtroom grew palpable. Jason's testimony was powerful, detailing every moment of that night. The fear, the anger, the helplessness he had felt as he was thrown to the ground, his dignity stripped away in front of his family. And when he spoke about his children, how they had been forced to witness their father being treated like a criminal, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. The verdict, when it finally came, was swift and decisive. The officers were found guilty of misconduct, and the department was ordered to pay damages to Jason and his family. It was a victory, but Jason knew it was only the beginning. There were still so many others like him, people who had been wronged by the system and never had the chance to fight back. In the days following the trial, Jason became a prominent voice in the movement for police reform. His story had resonated with people across the country, sparking protests and demands for accountability. But for Jason, the fight was far from over. He had won this battle, but the war against systemic injustice was still raging. As he stood on the steps of the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and supporters, Jason looked out at the faces of the people who had come to stand with him. His family was there, Kira, Jordan, Maya, all of them beaming with pride. They had been through so much, but together they had come out stronger. Jason took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling over him. The price of justice had been high, but it was a price he was willing to pay, again and again, for the future he wanted to build. For himself, for his family, and for every person who had ever been silenced by the system. As he stepped down from the courthouse steps, Jason knew that his fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Thank you for watching to the end. Subscribe to our channel and press the bell to not miss new stories. We have a lot of interesting things ahead of us, and other videos are already waiting for you, with exciting plots and unexpected twists. Leave a comment and tell us where you saw this video.